Welcome to episode 232 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this lovely album by Bud Powell, the fantastic jazz pianist. It came out originally in 1959. It's called The Amazing Bud Powell Volume 5. Blue Note had a whole series of these amazing Bud Powell albums. This is the last of those. This particular version is a 1983 Japanese reissue, which, true to Japanese reissues, has vinyl which is dead quiet. Powell is arguably the first truly modern jazz pianist in that he completes the revolution which Art Tatum had begun, moving away from the formerly dominant stride technique where the left hand was quite dominant, playing out the rhythms. The focus now is a focus on melodic improvisation with the right hand and the upper notes of the register on the piano. Not that I'm any great student of jazz piano, but even for the relatively observant amateur like myself, it's hard to overstate how important this is for the jazz piano to come, because this really lays the foundation for Bill Evans, for Herbie Hancock, for Chick Corea, pretty much anything that happens after 1950. But unlike Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, or Powell's only really serious rival for the originator of modern jazz piano, Thelonious Monk, Powell doesn't get the credit that his bebop contemporaries do. Sadly, this is likely due to the fact that his career was routinely interrupted by mental illness and hospitalization, bouts of alcoholism. His life was pretty chaotic from the moment he arrived in the big time until he died some 2 decades later. Bud Powell was born in Harlem in 1924 to a fairly musical family. His younger brother, Richie Powell, was also a jazz pianist, and he'd go on to have a significant career of his own. As a teenage musician in the early 1940s, young Bud would go and hang out at the Uptown House in Harlem, where people like Charlie Parker and also importantly Thelonious Monk would play. And Powell gets to know Monk. Monk is hugely impressed by his technique, by his musical ambition, and he introduces him to the whole scene at Minton's Playhouse, which was one of the real crucibles of the bebop sound. For a young musician learning his craft, there was no better hothouse of talent and innovation anywhere in the world of jazz than at that particular location with those players. On the other hand, for a kid with significant mental health vulnerability, this was an environment with all sorts of pitfalls into which, unfortunately, Powell fell. For the moment, it was the first part of that equation which worked out well, because Powell and Monk really fed off each other. Powell went through a period of enormous musical growth. He benefited from Monk's great interest in musical theory, musical experimentation. Both of them were highly committed to improvisation, and as a consequence, Powell's development just gets fast-tracked the same way that Coltrane's would a little over a decade later, the same kind of mentorship and the same kind of intense musical friendship with Monk. Like most of these players, the late-night bebop improvisation sessions weren't paying the bills for Powell, and so to make ends meet, he plays with a bunch of dance bands. The longest of these engagements was with the orchestra led by Cootie Williams. He's right in the mix at Minton's between 1942 and 1944, right there contributing to the creation of bebop, and is established as a very significant figure in that set, along with Monk and Parker and Gillespie and all those slightly more famous names than his. Sadly, very little of this music is actually captured on record because, of course, that period is covered by that 2 years which saw a strike by the American Musicians Union, which meant that no recording could take place, and so almost none of this great music was ever captured on record. In fact, the first time Powell appears on any recordings with the Williams Orchestra in 1944, but his time with Williams was to come to a very unhappy end in January 1945, just a few months later. After a gig in Philadelphia that month, he has a couple of drinks at the club, heads to the train station. He's apprehended by some police officers on suspicion, I guess, of being intoxicated while black. He's beaten up, he takes blows to the head with a truncheon, and he's never really quite the same after that point. He's got severe headaches from the beating. He suffers a mental breakdown, one of a number of recurring ones. He starts using alcohol and drugs to compensate. He ends up being committed to a mental institution for 2.5 months. When he gets out, he gets right back into the swing of things, and he plays and records in 1945 and 1946 with a whole bunch of luminaries: Kenny Clarke, Miles Davis, Dexter Gordon, Max Roach. The list is endless, and he starts to appear in more and more recordings as a sideman. He's also highly valued by his musical peers for a couple of reasons. First of all, his improvisational skill and technique was second to none amongst piano players, and he was basically seen as somebody who was able to translate the technique and the energy and the virtuosity that Parker was bringing to the alto sax onto the piano. The second reason that he was so important for his peers was that he was an incredible sight reader, and so he could be drafted in at a moment's notice into a gig or into a recording session, and within a few minutes be up to speed and be ready to play, which was not true of everybody. So things are going okay, but not for long, and that's kind of the story. In In November of 1947, he gets into another bar fight, gets hit in the head with a bottle, and he ends up being committed to a state mental facility for nearly a full year. In 1949, he gets out and he throws himself into recording in earnest. He does some excellent sessions for Blue Note, and these end up getting compiled as a 10-inch record, The Amazing Bud Powell. These are remarkable recordings, and they establish him very much as the equal of Parker when it comes to improvisation. That's released in, I think, 1951, and the rest of the 50s, despite all the drama happening in his life and the regular hospitalizations which were happening here and there, sometimes for very short durations, he's really quite productive musically. He does a lot of good work for Verve. He does a lot of good work for Blue Note. The Blue Notes are almost uniformly excellent. All of the Amazing Bud Powell series are worth picking up in their own way. The Verves are much more inconsistent, but maybe the best record of all of these that come out is The Genius of Bud Powell, which comes out on Verve, which is a real must-have. By the end of the 1950s, he was chronically unwell mentally. He was chronically unwell physically. He makes this record at the end of 1958, and then in early 1959, he moves to France with his girlfriend. In France, he enjoys a brief renaissance, but it's not sustained. He returns to New York in 1964, plays a few concerts, and then basically disappears. In 1966, he dies of tuberculosis, but with all kinds of underlying issues associated to alcoholism as well. He was only 41. His funeral procession in Harlem was attended by some 5,000 people who lined the streets as his casket went by. This record was made for Blue Note on December 29, 1958. The engineer is Rudy Van Gelder. It's made in his parents' front room. The producer, of course, is Alfred Lyon. Bud Powell, of course, is on piano. If you're not used to his playing, you're in for a surprise because he kind of half scats, half grunts with every note practically, all the way through his playing, all the way through both sides of the record. And it's really actually, unlike Glenn Gould, where you're sort of wondering if that's what he's doing. It's very clear that's what he's doing, and especially if you're wearing headphones, you pick it up all the way through. On bass is Paul Chambers, the brilliant sideman for Miles Davis, and on so many records for Blue Note, and also, of course, a leader for a number of records on Blue Note as well. And on drums is Art Taylor. Taylor, at this point, was, I guess, what would count as a longtime collaborator of Powell, and during the 50s, I think up to this point, he'd already played on 6 or 7 different Powell releases. Cleopatra's Dream starts side 1, super fast pace, almost bebopish, I guess, its intensity. Even though it's very upbeat and really, gets you snapping finger and tapping toe, it has a kind of a mournful feel a little bit. I also find that Powell's playing, I would not ever call it sloppy, but it feels a little bit ragged to me, like almost as if his improvisational brain is a step or two ahead of his hands. The second track is Do a Deed, which slows things down. It's a bluesier feel and a very, very infectious riff. Then we have Down With It. Tempo rises again, and finally, after 2 tracks with really only Powell being featured, we have A Moment for Somebody Else. Chambers has a little arco solo on bass, followed by Taylor. Danceland is another blues, and here what I've called Powell's raggedness is deployed to really good effect, where he moves off the beat and back onto it very subtly, but it gives a very relaxed feel. The last track on side 1 is Borderic, which has a jaunty, almost ragtime-ish kind of feel. I felt this was a little bit of a throwaway tune. On side 2, Crossing the Channel is right back up to the level of intensity that Cleopatra's Dream led off with on side 1. Now we come to Coming Up, which is 8 minutes long. It's basically the centerpiece, not just of side 2, but of the whole record. It's built on a 6-note motif on drums and bass. It's very interesting, it's a very fun track, and I would say the best track on this record by some distance. The second last track, Getting There, is a more traditional blues and probably Powell's crispest playing in the whole record. To close the record, we have the title track, The Scene Changes. This is another zesty, fast-paced workout, another arco bass solo from Chambers, another very tiny little drum solo from Taylor, and then a very abrupt ending to close the record. By most people's standards, this is a darn good record, and even if there isn't enough here to really touch the heights of Powell's early mid-50s output, there's still tons here to show that even declining Powell had amazing capacity. I do feel that there's a kind of a sameness to the mid-paced bluesy numbers, and I also feel like we don't really get as much as we could out of his bandmates, particularly the amazing Paul Chambers. But I do love Coming Up, which, as I said, I think is one of his greatest compositions. Definitely worth picking up for Coming Up and for the generally breathtaking level of piano playing. For me, this is 4 out of 5 stars.